Hey, good morning, everybody. My name's Tim Rose. I'm the owner and operator of Alexandria History Tours here in one of America's most historic city, Alexandria, Virginia. And right behind me is Church Episcopal, an active Episcopalian church, about 1,200 members, 3 services that take place on Sundays. Now, the church itself was originally part of the Church of England. The church sanctuary behind me dates back to 1773. Took about 6 years for the church itself to be built. Ground was broke on it 1767. Now, originally there was a Fairfax County parish that was established in 1765. That's as Fairfax County itself started to grow. It grew out of Prince William County. There's 2 churches that were associated with the parish. One is further north of here, up in what's called Falls Church, Virginia. At the time was the Church at the Falls, hence the name. And then the one right here in Alexandria, which for many years was simply known as the Alexandria Church or the Church in Alexandria. Another name for the churches, though, was Chapel of Ease. And think about this, very rural place at the time, so people are coming from all parts of Fairfax County, so they set up these small chapels that would be easy to get to, hence the name Chapel of Ease. Another name for it, though, the one that I find particularly interesting, was Church in the Woods. Now, at the time, the church behind me was built outside of the city limits of Alexandria. It was not too far. It was only a couple blocks from the original part of Alexandria, but it would have been in the woods, so it had much more of a rustic country church type of feel to it, and people did call it the Chapel of Ease or the Church in the Woods. Right behind me, it's one of my favorite spots to actually take a view of the church. You get the trees surrounding it, and it has that nice, good, rustic look as if you're in the woods going back to 1773. So, just a quick recap. Part of Fairfax Parish, and Fairfax Parish was created out of what was known as Truro Parish. Now, Truro Parish is south of here. There's a church to this day called Potomac Church. It's still an active Episcopalian church, similar to Christ Church right behind me. Now, George Washington himself was a member of both churches, both the church in Alexandria, now Christ Church, and Potomac Church, which was part of Truro Parish. So he was a member of Potomac, Christ Church, and he was a member of 2 parishes, Truro and Fairfax. Got all that? Okay, let's explain. Why was George Washington a member of both churches? Why was he a member of 2 parishes? Well, keep in mind, his property, Mount Vernon, it actually spanned across 5 farms. When he purchased the property, he acquired the property outright in 1761. He actually grew it from about 2,500 acres to 8,000 acres by the high point of his life. So at one point in his life, he had 8,000 acres at Mount Vernon. Now, this 8,000 acres across 5 farms at Mount Vernon fell into 2 different parishes. Truro Parish south of here, and Fairfax Parish, which is north of Mount Vernon. So from where I'm standing right now, Mount Vernon is about 8.5 miles south of here to actually get to the mansion house itself. From where I'm standing, though, the first part of Washington's property, what was known as his river farm, would have actually been about 4 miles south of here. So from here in Alexandria, go 4 miles south of here, going along the banks of the Potomac River, and you eventually make your way to George Washington's property, at least part of his property, the river farm very specifically. Yep. All right, coming back to this church here. So George Washington was a member of Fairfax Parish. He was a member of the church in Alexandria, Christ Church Episcopal, and he did purchase a pew in this church. In fact, he bought a pew in this church in February of 1773. Now, I'd like to get into a little bit of the details of the purchasing of this box pew. You see, this box pew was one of 10 that was sold to raise 220 pounds to actually pay the second builder of this church, a man named John Carlisle. John Carlisle, we already covered his house. Well, Carlisle was contracted to actually finish the construction of the church. Carlisle used a combination of indentured servants as well as enslaved laborers to actually have the church built in 1772 to 1773. The first builder of this church, a man named James Parsons, sadly dropped off the job after being awarded a contract of 600 pounds. So he left the church incomplete in 1772. Now, the 10 box pews I mentioned was to raise 220 pounds to pay John Carlisle. What's interesting, though, there was a little bit of discussion, debate that came up later on about whether the vestry, which is the governing body of this church, actually wanted to sell box pews. At one point in time, they had thought about it. They had made the decision to go ahead and do that. And then it looked like the decision was actually going to be reversed, and they were going to find another means of financing the church, which they could have done through actually taxing people at the time. In fact, think about this. This is part of the Church of England before the Revolutionary War. So in 1773, Christ Church is actually the established church in Virginia, being part of the Church of England. There is zero separation between church and state. In fact, the church, not only does it serve a lot of religious functions, but it serves a lot of civic functions as well. Consider this, the vestry, the governing body of the church, does do a lot of things that today we would associate with basically social service type work. Care for the poor, care for the orphans, care for people when they're sick. So think about it, all your things like basically general welfare and healthcare, it's being performed by the church in the pre-Revolutionary War period, the colonial period. Well, the vestry does decide they are going to move forward with the sale of 10 box pews to raise 220 pounds and pay John Carlisle. George Washington buys pew number 5. He bought it for 36 pounds 10 shillings, which was actually the highest price paid of the 10 box pews. And get this, that box pew is still in this church to this day. The very pew that George Washington sat in throughout the duration of his adult life, starting in 1773, is still here to this day. Now, one thing I want to mention is that in the colonial period, people's taxes, as I said, did support the church, and people were required to come to services at least once a month. What's interesting is that George Washington did fulfill that requirement, although he did split his time with the other church, Potomac Church in Truro Parish. But you can look at his writings, and he does come here relatively once a month or so. Maybe once every couple of months he does come here. Again, keep in mind, he's splitting his time with the other church. What's interesting to me, though, are the notable times that he came here in the run-up to the American Revolution. In fact, we know that he came here a week after the signing of the Fairfax County Resolves, which I talked about briefly in the prior video when we were at the John Carlisle house. In fact, George Washington came here July 24th of 1774. Well, after that, about a month and some change later, it was September of 1774, George Washington left Mount Vernon. He actually got on a ferry here in Alexandria, went across the river to Maryland on his trip up to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Keep in mind, the Fairfax County Resolves that was signed right here in Alexandria, Virginia, actually called for a colonial Congress, a colonial assembly, to bring the respective colonies together to actually discuss their grievances with the British Crown. So Washington, September through October of 1774, he's up in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. He does return, comes back to Mount Vernon in October of 1774, and a couple weeks later, he actually goes to Potomac Church on November 6th of 1774, and guess what? 1 week later, he returns here to Alexandria Church, Christ Church, November 13th of 1774. So I really like to point out those dates because you think about it, this is a very tense period of time. Right now, the established church, the Church of England Church, it's finding a lot of its members, a lot of its parishioners here in Virginia and throughout Fairfax County and Alexandria are very much starting to get upset with a lot of the policies of the mother country. So George Washington, what types of things would he be thinking about during these services? Well, wasn't quite thinking about full-on independence at that time. The First Continental Congress, there was still some hopes of actually reconciling the grievances with the British Crown, with the British government. but things are definitely progressing in that direction. And George Washington would attend a number of services here in 1775, as right before he's about to go off to the Second Continental Congress, which is what he does in May of 1775. In fact, in one occasion, when he comes to service here in 1775, right before the Second Continental Congress, George Washington actually noted coming to the Alexandria Church, Christ Church, and then on the same day, he actually worked to start the Prince William County Militia. Think about this. This is very much a treasonable offense. George Washington is coming to the established church, and then simultaneously on the same day, he's actually making plans to mobilize some of the military units that are ultimately going to take up arms against the British government. Let that set in for a moment. If you think we don't have a lot of history right here in Alexandria, think we don't have a lot of historic churches, well, frankly, I could be speaking here for the next couple hours. We've got a ton of history here. I have barely scratched the surface, but I want to take you all on another spot and actually take you to another part of this church, and we'll continue this journey. Follow me. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm standing here outside the entrance to Christ Church Episcopal. So I said that Christ Church was actually built by two people, two contractors. James Parsons was the first one, and then John Carlisle. Talked a lot about John Carlisle. One of the things that's interesting is that you can actually see some continuity between John Carlisle's home, the big, beautiful Georgian-style stone mansion, and Christ Church Episcopal. Now, keep in mind, John Carlisle's house, the Carlisle house, was built out of Aquia sandstone. What's interesting is that that sandstone is locally sourced about 30 miles south of here, down near Aquia Creek. Well, you can actually see some of the Aquia sandstone right here along the corners of Christ Church. Those are decorative coins, as they're called. And John Carlisle's house also has these decorative elements, these coins. The coins were made out of Aquia sandstone, very similar to Carlisle's house. So that's an interesting piece of continuity between the two properties, Christ Church and John Carlisle's house. Now, if you look at this plaque behind me, this is actually a plaque to George Washington's pallbearers. In fact, there's 6 pallbearers that are mentioned. They're often called honorary pallbearers. What it really was is the fact that they were Freemasons. So, in one of the few public acts that Freemasons did, they actually performed Masonic rites. They actually marched alongside of George Washington's casket during Washington's funeral, which was not here. It was actually at Mount Vernon and took place on the 4th day after his death. Washington died December 14, 1799. His funeral was at Mount Vernon December 18, 1799. So you have the 6 Freemasons. Interesting little fact, one of them, Marsteller, wasn't really a Freemason, so perhaps they just had him improvise, perhaps they just told him what to do, but he wasn't actually an official Freemason. And then there's 4 names below the 6 honorary pallbearers. Those are the actual beer bearers, B-I-E-R, not beer like getting a case of Miller Lite. Beer bearers are actually doing the heavy lifting of the casket itself. There's actually a very interesting story about one of the beer bearers who's actually buried in Lambertville, New Jersey, a man named George Coryell, who's not mentioned on this plaque, oddly enough, although Coryell did step in when one of the beer bearers, William Moss, you see his name on the plaque here, ended up struggling with the casket. Some people say that maybe he got sick. Either way, Moss had some issues with the beer. George Coryell actually stepped in and helped carry it. So he was kind of like, I call it like a JV player stepping up to the varsity league, if you will. One of the things I also find interesting about George Coryell, his family actually operated a ferry along the Delaware River, Coryell's Ferry. Now, there are multiple references to George Washington's army using Coryell's Ferry, as well as a lot of the boats that were used to operate the ferry itself. In fact, the Coryell family, George Coryell's father in particular, was extremely helpful to Washington and his army getting across the Delaware River on the very crucial evening, December 25th, 26th of 1776. So that's a really, really important connection. What's interesting about that evening, December 25th into the morning of December 26th of 1776, is that this was George Washington leading an attack on the Hessian garrison in Trenton, New Jersey. So the Battle of Trenton, which was really a turning point of the Revolutionary War. It was a surprise attack. A lot of people talk about how the Hessians were drunk, that they were sort of hungover that next morning. There's some disputes on whether that was the case or not. Nevertheless, they did not expect Washington and his army to actually launch this attack, which they did sometime really after the break of dawn on December 26th of 1776. George Washington's second cousin, Colonel William Washington, at the time, he was Captain William Washington. He got promoted later, but he was actually part of the 3rd Virginia Regiment. He was at the vanguard of Washington's army, actually one of the what we might call as an advanced party unit, to use current military language. So he was at the vanguard advanced party to help actually lead that attack against Trenton, against the Hessians at Trenton. What's interesting is that William Washington, now Captain Washington, actually had a second in command, Lieutenant James Monroe. Our 5th president, and also a Revolutionary War veteran, and one of our presidents from Virginia. Now, why am I bringing all this up? James Monroe was actually one of the few Continental soldiers that was injured. If you think about it, this was a major victory for the American Army, and there weren't a lot of casualties on the American side. Lieutenant Monroe, James Monroe, was one of the few casualties. He was actually shot in his shoulder. And guess where he recovered from his wounds? At the Coryell House. Really interesting connection, right? So George Coryell was in his teenage years at that point in time. He was a younger man, but in his own house at that time would have been our 5th president, James Monroe, recovering from wounds that he sustained during the Battle of Trenton. Now, George Coryell later moved to Alexandria in the 1790s. He was actually a local carpenter here in town, and he was at Mount Vernon on December 18th of 1799, the day of George Washington's funeral. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of these honorary pallbearers, the Freemasons that I mentioned here, a couple names that stick out. One is Colonel Charles Sims. Sims is actually physically buried here in this graveyard or burial ground adjacent to Christ Church Sanctuary, that is. If you're looking for the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery, well, this is a graveyard because we got the church here. The church does have a separate cemetery complex about 3/4 of a mile southeast from here. So the difference is that the cemetery is separated from the church itself. So if you want to get real pedantic about things, just know graveyard has the church. Cemetery does not have the church. The church is actually separated from the cemetery itself. So take a look at the inside of Christ Church here. What's interesting as you're looking at the east wall of the church, you'll notice these panels here. So these panels were hand-painted in 1773. And these panels are the 10 Commandments, which is the right panel. And you can see then the New Testament with the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, and the Golden Rule there at the bottom. So these were part of the Church of England decree that you had to have the 10 Commandments prominently displayed. Keep in mind that is the basis of civic and religious law. And then you see the New Testament with the Lord's Prayer, Apostles' Creed, and Golden Rule that accompanies the Old Testament with the 10 Commandments. You'll notice the pulpit. It's a wine glass shaped pulpit. It's deliberately set up or deliberately made to look like a wine glass shape. That is representing the chalice cup for the rite of Holy Eucharist. So very symbolic visual there. And you notice that the pulpit is raised. There is a lot of hierarchy in the Church of England, so the rector is speaking above the congregation. And if you think about in the colonial period, Church of England, the rector is speaking both as the mouthpiece for the church and the mouthpiece for government as well. So no separation of church and state. And then above the rector's head, to make sure that everybody knows the rector is speaking from a position of authority. You do have an item above the rector's head. In this case, the specific board is called a sounding board. It does have an acoustic quality to it, so the sounding board allows the rector's voice to be transmitted throughout the congregation. The voice does bounce off the sounding board and gets dispersed throughout the entirety of the sanctuary. So it does have that very distinct acoustic quality. The churches are very much auditory experiences more than visual experiences. If you look at the pews themselves, they were originally all in a box shape, so very distinctly a box shape. They have since been converted into what are known as slip pews, all facing the east wall of the church. But the box pews that have been preserved, one is the George Washington box pew. So that has been deliberately preserved for the purpose of actually the memory of George Washington, the history of George Washington having purchased that pew February of 1773 for 36 pounds, 10 shillings, and owning that pew. He actually had physical ownership of it throughout the duration of his life. In the 1780s, we know that he paid pew rents on the pew. He actually paid an annual subscription of £5 a year for his box pew. So that was an important thing, especially as the church was looking for new means of financing and supporting itself financially after it broke from the Church of England. So the pew rents and the subscription that people paid was very important. So the organ that you see in the back of the church, that organ was installed in 2021. So it's relatively new. It was actually built in Durham, England by a company called Harrison & Harrison. It did cost north of 7 figures. It was a very expensive organ, so it took several years for the church to actually raise the money to purchase that. It is what's known as a Bromley organ. And fun fact, that organ is actually the church's 6th organ. The original organ dated back to early 1800s, sometime around 1809, 1810. It was there for about 30 years. So the first organ was there till about 1840. That organ is actually now owned by the Smithsonian Museum of American History. Well, thanks a lot for taking this brief journey of Christ Church Episcopal. There is a lot more history to discover here at Christ Church. This church has over 250 years of history. We're really trying to lean into the colonial period history, the history on the road to the American Revolution, history during the Revolution, especially with America's 250th coming up next year. We hope you'll come to Alexandria, Virginia and experience this all for yourself. We hope that you'll take a tour with us here in Alexandria. If you've already taken a tour with us, well, then we hope you'll use these videos as a good resource, as a good tool to remember your trip, remember your visit, and encourage other people to come back. If you did like this video, please go ahead and leave a positive comment. Also share it with a friend, subscribe to the channel. We're going to be putting out a lot more videos. When we're not doing videos, when we're not doing tours, we're doing a lot of original research. So we're always trying to learn new things about this church, about Alexandria, and about our great nation, the United States of America. Thank you so much for taking this brief journey with us in Alexandria. We look forward to more to follow soon, more videos soon. Thank you.